On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, France Yellow Vest protests, all about fuel taxes or there's more than meets the eye. And China-U.S. relations at crossroads, two well-respected Chinese scholars present possible solutions. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's program in France, where protesters known as Yellow Vests have effectively forced the French government to make a major concession. Planned increase in fuel tax by a few cents per liter starting next year has been suspended. But the leaderless movement presents deeper and wider resentments in French society. The working class in France, like elsewhere, are trying to say they are hardly getting by, and they believe their president is not on their side. Let's take a look.
France's most violent protests in decades have forced the government to back down. Yellow Vest protesters, angry at the rising cost of fuel, have taken to the streets since mid-November. Now, Prime Minister Edouard Philippe says he wants things to calm down.
Après avoir entendu cette demande exprimée,
after nearly all of the parties that I spoke with during the consultations that I held these last few days made these demands, I am suspending these tax measures.
Edouard Philippe's announcement is a major U-turn, a climb down from what President Emmanuel Macron said only last week.
I will not give in to those who seek destruction and disorder.
But something had to give after the most recent protests on Saturday. The mayor of Paris says $4.5 million worth of damage may have been caused to city infrastructure. And more than 200 petrol stations have run out of fuel due to Yellow Vest blockades at oil refineries.
The French Retail Federation says shops have been heavily affected too. Sales have fallen by over a third, all ahead of the busy Christmas shopping period.
There are still a number of Yellow Vest roadblocks around France. What started off as a protest against fuel tax has morphed into anger at the general cost of living.
I don't think it's sufficient, and I think the government should take a step back and put more on the table.
The Yellow Vest movement has no official leadership, so it's hard to know what concessions will satisfy the diverse group of opinions. With more protests called for this weekend, the government will be waiting anxiously to see if it has offered enough.
So what do the French Yellow Vest protests mean for the country and probably beyond? With us in our Beijing studio, Wang Yiwei, who is the Dean Jean Monnet Chair of a professor and also from the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University. In Paris, we invited Joe Rouet, the chairman at the Bridge Tank, and also in Paris, JOAV TOKER, professor at the American Graduate School in Paris, joining us. I want to welcome the three of you, gentlemen, for being with us. Let me start by asking you, Professor TOKER, how much do you think this is a retreat by the French government this time?
Very much, very much. We have agglomeration of elements of which we see the relevant ingredients for us to analyze just in a partial way right now, at the moment we are speaking. Of course, the political, economic and fiscal elements which had triggered these 3 weeks of violence and going rain are those related to taxing policies, to gasoline prices. But the nature of the crisis and the modalities through which this crisis is developing as we are talking in present continuous are well beyond, and I would suspect them to be well beyond the fiscal, economic, numerical
then what exactly is it?
We are speaking about rage, we are speaking about anger. It is a combination of long accumulated, how should I say, set of feelings of resentment which have something to do with human respect, with classes and sectors of society, mainly those who are semi-urban or semi-rural, who for a long time now, well before President Macron won the elections a year and a half ago, it's a well-accumulated procedure, have felt that they are in a way distanced away from where real decisions are being taken and real considerations are being addressed to. And
Mr. Rouet, on the other hand, let me ask you as well about
this being expressed.
Let me ask you as well, Mr. Rouet, your thoughts about this. Of course, people feel disadvantaged. The anger and the rage also presented onto the streets. But once the government retreated this time, are we going to see domino effects of further government retreats about some of the directional policies that this administration has been thinking about and advocating? Mr. Rouet.
Yeah, thank you for your question. You know, I would want to say that what the rest of the world sees today is violence and disorder. Now, it might be impressive and images magnify this violence and disorder, but violence is sometimes part of the political process. Fortunately, not every time, but whenever there's an anger, when there's an accumulated lapse of solutions on a growing anger, you would expect violence. So I think on the other hand, what matters, to get back to your question on what we can expect, is whether there is a debate, whether there is a discussion. And I think that unfortunately today, as we speak of today, the summarizing word is cacophony. Cacophony. Everyone speaks, everyone talks aloud, and no one is hearing, no one is listening at the others. We have a prime minister who retrenched, and he said to balance, to patch up, with his retrench, he said that he's heard, that he's listened, that he has understood the anger and etc. But the way the government is communicating, different ministers communicate differently. The people and the workers consider it's not been heard fully, and that there's more a rampant problem. And the government has replied either too late or in a too minimalistic way. It's, I agree, not just a matter of gasoline price, it's a matter of perceived cost of living. And I think that the real debate should be needed where everyone listens to different parties. As of now, we're not there,
Mr. Rouet, therefore, I want to once again ask, because for those, as the Chinese say, in the picture, it's very hard to figure out what exactly the whole picture looks like. And you and Professor TOKER are exactly in the picture. But if you go one step further, what exactly is the nature of this debate, or what you call lack of debate? Is it about, directional speaking, where France wants to go in terms of governance, in terms of some of the most important trends about climate change and some of the other issues? Or is it mainly about lack of communication? Because these two are very different from one another. We cannot just mix them up and say there's a problem. Mr. Rouet, very briefly from you.
No, you're absolutely right. There is the background and there is the communication. The problem is that this time the two have intertwined. You know, there's definitely a problem of communication because Emmanuel Macron, the French president, said he wants to be the president of every French person, and he's neither left nor right. Now the problem is that every single French person is either left or right. So there's a problem of communication at the beginning. So either he leaves the communication to his prime minister, and he can be the president of everyone, or he enters into the debate and then he's trapped. And this is what happened. On the background, what matters is the cost of living. Now the cost of living is, we're a rich country, and Europe, generally speaking, has 20 of the 20 out of 30 richest countries in the world. The problem is not so much how much you have on paper. The problem is how much you are left with at the end of the month once every compulsory tax, compulsory expense is paid.
Okay, in that sense,
very, very deep.
I know you can go on, and we are talking to two Frenchmen, right, to say the least. And secondly, you have a lot of passion about what is going on inside the country, certainly a lot to share, but we do want to get some of the most important points out of the ideas. Professor TOKER, is France going to change as a result of this setback? Directional in terms of where it is in Europe, where it is on some of the most important and crucial issues in the world, including climate change, including governance. Professor TOKER, briefly, if you can.
Yes, I think so. I do not think that the real explanation, the profound explanation for the crisis is directly linked to climate change or even to the purchasing power, and certainly not the price of gasoline. We are speaking about models of political communication, sure enough, as my colleague very rightly emphasized, but beyond communication, it is an overall perception of a long-run type of regime, type of governance, which is not just a list of what kind of measures Parliament votes on and what are the priorities, the formal official priorities of the government. But the way, don't forget, the President Macron, the specificity of President Macron is that he emerged a year and a half ago with a brilliant political analysis regarding the electoral scene, but with very little political experience when it comes to governing. And it may very well be what we're into right now, namely brilliant people, brilliant leaders with long range and far-right ambitions on the European scene as well as on French internal scene and the international arena, and they are blocked by that lack of political experience, namely the way you rightly feel, gather, perceive what real people all over your country feel like.
Professor Wang, it is no surprise that we are seeing a new generation of leaders. You see in major countries around the world that they are new on the international scene. They are new also on their domestic political scene. There seems to be many of them. And therefore, are we going to see a combination of both governance style, lack of experience, but trying to do their best as they see it, with quite an urgent agenda, plus a dramatically changing world? What's going to be the three elements mixed up mean for this leadership?
I think for France, it's go beyond that. The new generation's leader, the French President Macron, is very young, and most importantly, his party is very young. Only 1 year before established, so-called La République en Marche is not traditional strong party. So his way of doing is too sharp, without enough facility, efficient to mobilize the people and make a compromise among different parties. And his ambitions is too big, not domestically to reform the French economy, climate change, want to take the leading role, even in the European Union. So social and political support domestically not catch up with. So that's the protest is happening.
In other words, his dream is too big to be realized within the current circumstances. What you're trying to suggest, Professor Wang?
I think the economy problem is the rich and the poor, the gap is still very huge. The French, at the beginning, they cut the tax because of, and people blame him as just for the rich. Then they want to increase the budget for more climate change research, to international, want to make the French voice to be more heard. And then they need to raise the tax. And then that happened.
Mr. Rouet, here's the interesting thing. I mean, on the one hand, France is eager to take the leadership role in terms of some of the most important international issues, particularly climate change. we do not want to forget it is called the Paris Climate Agreement. And secondly, you do see that there is a vacuum, for example, within the European Union, with the current changes going on, and Germany, particularly Angela Merkel, losing out in her party. It seems to be the time for France to step up and play a bigger role. And thirdly, you see during the G20 and some of the other occasions, French president standing up and trying to say, let's make the world work. However, you do see now that he has fire in the backyard. So what does that mean, the internationally ambitious and yet domestically limited president? What's going to be his choice?
Yeah, I'll be very clear and very brief. We have a president, we have a prime minister. The president, and they have different jobs. The president is determined for his reform and for taking the lead. But we have allies. China is an ally of France. China has the China dream. France has the France dream. The coming year is the Sino-French year for energy transition and for ecological civilization. We are determined to contribute into that. This year, the G20 is chaired by Japan in Asia, and by the G7 is chaired by France, and there will be a strong coordination on that. So France is going to play his whole role, and etc. On the domestic side, I think President Macron is learning. He's learning that the role of the president is to be slightly afar from the domestic scene, and that this is the role of the prime minister to do that. Now, the prime minister is experienced. This is the first thing. And the second last thing that I want to say is that despite the parties are young, the solutions are existing in France. Every time we have a major crisis, what we do in France, this was true in '68, this was true in '95, this was true for environment at the beginning of François Hollande's reign, we all sit together and we start listening to each other. There's a word in France for that, it's called a Grenelle. Grenelle is the place where, the name of the street where the discussions and the negotiation after the 1968 crisis were solved. We have a tool, and we are getting close to this tool, I believe.
Professor Wang, we see the retreat on the fuel tax is only one thing, but you also see France is also eager to push some of the other buttons that they consider as important, such as taxing some of the high-tech companies that are operating in Europe. And that will be quite a lead in a way compared to the other countries. Meanwhile, climate change, as we said, with this fuel tax, some of the ideas behind it. And at the same time, France is trying to make what they consider, at least the current administration considers, as the advanced policy in order to indicate its direction of governance. So, Professor, is it too early? Or it's not being done in the right way? If France is facing such situation, does it mean nobody else will step up anymore on these fronts?
I think the President Macron do the right thing. The direction is very, very right. So we just a question about the way of doing is so eager to reach the dreams and the goals. I just come back from Paris, attending the first track to China-French high-level dialogue. There, there's also Senate, the State Secretary of the Climate Change, and the thing about the China and French partnership should move forward. Climate change definitely is the most important of that kind of goal. You know, there's the so-called G2 during Obama administration, China-U.S. cooperation make the climate change deal in Paris, and now because Trump, withdrew the Paris Accord, so President Macron want to hold this flag and then promote the relation between, with China, because the French, they're very worried about that the digital economy, AI, France and even Germany, all other European countries lag behind of the US and China. So climate change, I think is considered about the human civilization. The traditional way of living, producing is unsustainable. Right. So we support that, definitely.
And what does that mean? I mean, if we have seen what we have seen and how the fuel tax is being scrapped off as a result of the protest in the streets, can France partners be confidently work with France on some of these big agendas?
Well, of course, the climate change should pay the costs. You know, the new low carbon economies it's very cost. So we need maybe risk tax from other place, from other areas, not this the oil. Still, we should do that. And China is also very, I think, dramatically changed from the cutting the CO2 emission. Right. This is where the France make I think it is possible to cooperate with China.
Mm-hmm. Professor TOKER, your thought as well. The way forward, much challenge ahead.
Oh, much challenge ahead for sure. And don't forget that if we have to contextualize things on both political, economic, and environmental issues, the overall context is full of question marks. Should I mention here the list of question marks regarding what international policies, including environmental ones, are to be concerned due to President Trump's options? Should I mention the instability due to Brexit? Should I mention European instability in terms of what is happening in terms of populist movements in Italy, in Hungary, in Poland, and elsewhere? So Macron, when he was elected a year and a half ago, was perceived, and rightly so, as sort of a source of hope well beyond French borders, in terms of European solidity, in terms of being able to establish something which would be a counterpart to President Trump's bizarreries or strange new elements into the international game. And of course, the fact that he is being weakened now, and perhaps even more than weakened, at least for the a short run, is highly meaningful, well beyond French borders. But we shouldn't exclude also a restabilization of the situation, not tomorrow, not in 1 week, but say in a run, and then things, don't forget that just 3 weeks ago, none of the elements we're talking about today were visible. So I wouldn't exclude a situation in which things would come back to relative rationality in not a very, very long time.
Right. Thank you so much for the three of you gentlemen for helping us understand the real situation. It might make a lot of sense for the headline news that we see the violence in the streets in France. However, it is much more than that, that the thoughts have already been provoked about where is the road ahead for France. Thank you so much, JOAV TOKER, JOAV, and also Wang Yiwei. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program. China-U.S. relations at crossroads. Two well-respected Chinese scholars present possible solutions right after this break.
In this episode of Travelogue, I set out on a spiritual journey to discover Zen. I'll learn how Zen inspired Steve Jobs to create his iconic designs, and how its principles help us to lead a more rewarding, mindful life.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Welcome to the world today on CGTN.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Last Saturday, over dinner in Buenos Aires, Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump reached some consensus on working out a way for the two countries to work together to resolve the trade dispute. Since then, questions have been posed about the likelihood of the two sides reaching a deal. China's Commerce Ministry says it's optimistic it can reach a consensus with the U.S. on their lengthy trade dispute over the next 90 days, and that both sides will ultimately try to remove all tariffs.
The recent meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump was successful. They have reached an important consensus on their trade issues. China and the U.S. share extensive common interests on trade and have a natural, complementary and structural dependency on each other. Our negotiating teams are maintaining smooth communication and good cooperation. We are confident we can reach an agreement with the U.S. in the next 90 days.
90 days, just how much can be achieved within 3 months? What lies ahead for China and the United States beyond the timeline? And how will issues beyond the tariffs be resolved? For example, strategic issues between China and the United States. I pose these questions to Professor QINGGUO at the Peking University's School of International Studies. And here is what he has to say. Time is really the issue here, isn't it?
I think time is, as you put it, very important for both sides. For Trump, you know, the good days of high growth of U.S. economy cannot last forever. Okay? And it's in his interest to prolong it as much as possible.
Yes.
Okay? You know, especially in the light of the fact that the election is coming up in 2 years. Okay? How to keep the U.S. economy up instead of letting it fall, especially is try to complicate it with the trade war. That's that should be his top priority. And as far as China is concerned, China's economy has been weak and weakening. So China also wants to have a quick fix of the trade war problem, and then so that China can, you know, maintain the current level and try to increase the growth in the days to come. And China has so many things to do at home. A well-performing economy is essential for China to accomplish those goals. If the relationship has a so-called soft landing, that shows how strong the ties between the two countries are. Right. Because we are talking about a group of very hawkish people in the Trump administration. Okay? And they are in charge. They are making the demands on China. And we are also talking about a very strong leader on the Chinese side. So if these two groups of people can work together to find some solution, pragmatic solution for the two countries, the relationship is safe. Okay, but
so this will
you know,
be a great test.
We may not pass the test. I don't know. I just think that the chance for us to pass the test is still quite high. Yeah.
Some of those in the world are trying to decouple China from whether it's the international trade system or the international governance. Of course, they can't do that, as we all know, but what and how will China react to such efforts will also be extremely crucial for China's own choice of its future.
Well, the best thing that China can do is first not to be misled by those attempts. Okay? They want to decouple, I'll decouple anyway with you. I think it's not the right way. And secondly, I think China should reflect on itself. You know, why we still face all these demands and challenges from others. Of course, they have their own problems.
That's right.
But what about our problems? Okay, what can we do to improve on our side so that the decoupling argument will not go as strong as
will die out.
Yeah, would disappear eventually if you are doing well. Okay. The best response, as far as China is concerned, is try to improve itself rather than blaming others. It doesn't help. Okay.
It's what the Chinese traditionally believe as the 君子,
right?
The right practice of the 君子, the noble man. Will that work in politics?
Well, in the short run, you may appear to be naive and simplistic, but in the long run, it works. I think a country that sees the larger things, that has its own vision and has the ability to stick to that vision and persist in doing things that it sees right, will prevail.
Before we go, I do want to invite your wisdom about how is China looking at its own role in the world. Some suggest whether China is having a hidden agenda. Some suggest is China just playing soft from the outside and having pretty much a big ego in the heart. Professor Jia, as someone who's been working on China's international policy for a long time, and knowing the nuances that is going on here in this country, what exactly is it?
I think China is still struggling to define its role in world affairs, okay? Because China is still in the process of rise, okay? As a rising power, China is no longer the China of the past, but it is not yet the China of the future. Okay? So during this period, China is also the China of the past and in part China of the future. Okay? For example, China is a developing country and a developed country at the same time. China is a poor country and a rich country at the same time. It's a weak country and a strong country at the same time. Ordinary country and a superpower at the same time. Identities define interests. Okay. China has two sets of interests at the same time on many issues. So which one is your best interest? You don't know. It's very difficult to figure out. For example, on climate change, defending the right to development versus cutting emission. Which one is China's interest? I think both are China's interests, but they are in conflict. Okay? So what kind of role can China play? National interests define China's policy. The problem is you have two sets of national interests in conflict, and then this complicates your foreign policy behavior. So during this period of time, I think Chinese are still trying to figure out what we should do, what kind of world we desire. Okay, I think it will take some time for China to develop a kind of a consensus on such kind of issues as China's identities begin to form. Okay, like when China becomes a more developed country, a rich country, a strong country, and a superpower, then it will be much easier for China to define its role, to decide what kind of world it wants.
But this is the transition that we're talking about.
Now
That's
we are in the process of transition. It's very difficult for China to define its role.
As we all know, relations between China and the United States are not just about trade. This was the case in the past, and it will be the case in the future. On the 18th of December, 1978, at the third plenary session of the 11th Party Central Committee, China's leaders decided to set the country on a new course of reform and opening up. Just 2 days earlier, On December the 16th, China and the United States, the two countries, simultaneously published the joint communique of the establishment of the two countries' diplomatic relations. So how did China's policy of reform and opening up interact with the relations between China and the United States? Recently, I sat down with Yuan Peng, the president of China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. He says the interlink between the two is definite.
The past 40 years show that, on the one hand, Chinese opening up and reform is a very successful end. That is China from the underdeveloped country to #2 economy in the world. But don't forget, we have another successful story. That is U.S.-China relations. With so big, so huge political system, social system differences, ideological differences, we didn't have any kind of a hot war and even cold war. And the trade amount from $2.5 billion in 1979 up to almost $600 billion last year. So it's amazing. It's also very big success. The problem is that after 40 years of the two great successes, now we're entering another 40 years.
That is exactly the question I want to ask you about. Will the two events, will the two issues still be closely linked with one another?
They bound to have some interlinked, but the different contents. I think,
explain, please.
40 years ago, the interlink that is that the U.S.-China relations normalization is very useful for Chinese opening up and reform. We need American investment. America needs Chinese market. So we're interdependent in the past maybe 30 years at least. But now China entering a new era. In this new era, when Americans view the new eras of China, they have a different view of China. 40 years ago, the view of China is a very underdeveloped China. They embrace China into American-led international order. They thought they want to drag China in so that to change China. But the 40 years history showed that China is successful, but Chinese social system, political system remain, and we have more confidence than before. Then some Americans feel, uneasy, feel disappointed, even feel frustration. Then they want to have some new strategy. But 40 years of the history told us U.S.-China relations, Chinese development, Americans' development, those things are highly, linked with each other.
We provide chances for each other.
So today is a time for us to rethink this. How new round of Chinese opening up and reform linked with the new framework of U.S.-China relations. And the U.S.-China relations, what's U.S.-China relations moving ahead really depends on how Chinese new round of reform and opening up.
Moving on to the next stage, here is the thing about whether there has been continuity in China's approach about its own reform and opening up.
From Chinese point of view, my personal thinking is that today's reform and opening up is more continuity than radical change. For example, today many think Chinese today focus on party's leadership. Don't forget when Deng Xiaoping embarked the first round of opening up and reform, he thought that the precondition for opening up and reform is 4 basic principles.
Which include?
Which include stick to the leadership by Chinese Communist Party, stick to socialism with Chinese characteristics. And Deng Xiaoping said Chinese economy is a socialism market economy. They never said Chinese market economy is a capitalism market economy, which means SOE, state-owned economy, bound to be part of the Chinese market economy. Today, we still have SOEs. And Deng Xiaoping also said Chinese will stick to socialism with Chinese characteristics. So from all those examples I provided to you, that this is a very big continuity rather than radical change. The change is that today's China is different from 40 years ago, because 40 years ago, Chinese is very underdevelopment. Today's China is the #2 economy, comprehensive national power, much more developed and stronger. We're now entering a new era. So we're bound to have some change. For example, today we hold more responsibility regionally and globally. Today we have more investment rather than absorb investment from abroad. And today Chinese reform is not just from the white paper. Now the reform is much more difficult, because
deep water area.
Deep water area, lots of interest groups and status quo powers from all aspects in China. So much harder. So which means don't be too harsh. Otherwise, the reform won't be successful. So this is lots of misperception. So if you will have a comprehensive understanding of today's China, you need to readjustment your mindset. So both US and China will need mutual adjustment, not strategically, but psychologically.
That's very interesting, the phrase you just used, Professor Yuan, mutual adjustment. To the US side, you mentioned about several things that it should adjust to when it comes to the realities of China and the possible approach that the US could adopt vis-a-vis China. But what about from the Chinese side, the adjustment?
From Chinese side, we should have very clear understanding of Chinese new identity.
And which is?
Which is now we are #2 economy. We are, relatively speaking, we are much stronger country in the world than years before, than decades before. So any decision made by Chinese government, you should have built in your mind that we're easily to arouse the international reaction. How to be more capable in engaging the global governance, working with major countries, working with the partners in the world to jointly manage the difficulties that we all faced in the future.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.